Hi everyone, my name is Mark. I document cryptocurrency adoption across the world. In other words, I find communities, countries, and places where people are using cryptocurrency as a form of money, as a form of currency. Based on the name, you'd expect that would be the point of it. But in this video, I want to talk about two hotspots, two places in the world where cryptocurrency is actively being used as money. That is St. Kitts and El Salvador. I'm going to be comparing some of the pros and cons and the differences between these two crypto hotspots. And I'm a person that is qualified to do it in the sense that I have spent extensive time both in St. Kitts and in El Salvador. In El Salvador, I was there leading up to and during Bitcoin becoming the legal tender. I have produced 2 full documentaries on the topic, and I returned a second time to find out whatever happened to Bitcoin in El Salvador. St. Kitts, very similar story, spent much of my time there and also was there in participating in Bitcoin Cash sweeping across the island and becoming effectively a local currency without the government support, at least not yet. So with all that said, let's dive into some of the differences and similarities of both of these places. Firstly, let's talk about official government support. Well, obviously there are some big differences. This video is being made on March 29th. It's actually an ideal time for me to make this video, and let me explain why. While I'm recording this, I am actively engaged in finalizing the edit to my second documentary on Bitcoin in El Salvador. So all of that is very fresh. And at the same time, it is the month of March of 2023. This month is when we are supposed to hear back from the government of St. Kitts, Bitcoin Cash becoming a legal tender of that country. All of this is happening right now. We're right at the pinnacle, you could say, of all of this in my head, and it's a great time for me to express some of my thoughts on the topic. I keep in mind that in crypto, things change very fast. So it is March 29th. We are expecting a response on the legal status of Bitcoin Cash as a national currency this month. So who knows, in a week from now, this video may be very outdated or there might be questions. I have no idea. As far as governments, let's talk about this a little bit. In El Salvador, Bitcoin is in fact a national legal tender. In other words, you can pay your bills, you can pay debt, you can pay utilities, taxes, all of that. It's all legal and fairly dandy. In St. Kitts, that's not exactly the case right now. Bitcoin Cash is not an official legal tender. So if you have a debt that you owe someone, or you want to pay your utility bills, or you want to pay a fee to the government, a driver's license fee, you can't use Bitcoin Cash. And in fact, when I went back to El Salvador, I was able, in theory, to pay with Bitcoin at the airport for my tourist visa. I say in theory because they actually didn't accept Bitcoin, they accepted Lightning, but depending on who you ask, that's splitting hairs. So right off the bat, we have some differences which illustrate one of the big philosophical differences of both islands, which is in the case of El Salvador, it's mostly but not completely a bottom-down approach where the government made Bitcoin a legal tender, and now communities are starting to use it to some degree. Versus St. Kitts, a large degree, a very substantial degree of local businesses started accepting Bitcoin Cash before the government started considering of Bitcoin Cash becoming a legal tender. Now I say somewhat because in the case of Bitcoin, it's not completely fair to say that it's a top-down approach because there was one community known as the Bitcoin Beach of El St, where Bitcoin was being used as a form of currency. And that little beach got attention from politicians and also journalists and other people in the international community as well as the Salvadorian community as being a reference point for making the country adopt Bitcoin. So let's cover how Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash started getting attention in their two countries. So with Bitcoin, here is the story. There's a local charity called the Hope House in El St. A Bitcoiner from outside of El Salvador came to this community and talked with the charity and said, look, you guys want to accomplish a lot of good things. I will fund you. I will provide you Bitcoin to do everything you want to do. Build an office, teach local students English, build houses for local people. However, there's going to be a catch. Any of the money we give you cannot be sold for US dollars, which is the currency of El Salvador. In other words, if you want to hire a teacher to teach your kids English, you need to find a teacher who will be willing to accept Bitcoin. Now, this was very smart and very clever and very admirable. The charity is now incentivized to onboard everyone they can to accept their form of money, Bitcoin, in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. They're incentivized to support Bitcoin in that local community. And at the beginning, it sort of didn't matter that it was Bitcoin. It could have been anything. It could have been Nano, could have been Monero, could have been whatever, could have been yen. It's not tied to the US government. It's not inflated. So there's a lot of wonderful aspects of Bitcoin that over time in the community, they probably came to appreciate. But it was still someone on the outside that was coming in and basically bargaining with a local charity. Again, I'm not saying that in a bad way. I think that's extremely smart, and I think that should be done by every crypto chain in every part of the world where charity is needed and required. On the Bitcoin Cash side, it's a little bit different. With St. Kitts, there was already a little bit of interest in crypto because there were some crypto supporting people that lived down there. There was maybe a few businesses that accepted crypto in some limited capacity, but it wasn't until a local man discovered Bitcoin Cash and started to see the value of it that Bitcoin Cash really started to grow, because a local person, not an external person, started doing very aggressive onboarding. This local person also owned a liquor distribution company there, one of the bigger ones, if not the biggest. What made that really useful is he's in connection with all the other businesses. And he said, look, I will accept Bitcoin Cash for any of my products. So if you have people that come to your restaurant and spend Bitcoin Cash, you can buy your liquor from me with Bitcoin Cash. It created a natural, organic, grassroots economy where local people suddenly had this new form of currency that they could actually actively use in a circular fashion. So that was really interesting and very unique. And because of Sonny, his connections with all the local people, this was really able to spread in a very limited amount of time. We're talking about a period of months versus El Salvador taking really years for Bitcoin to get the level of attention that it ended up getting. Now, I do want to repeat, I'm actually not painting a bias on either method. I'm not saying that this being more local because it's a local person that's doing the onboarding makes it any better, let's say, than the what happened in El Salvador. It was just a different methodology that created a different, let's say, set of expectations and culture within the two communities of what that crypto represents and where it comes from. Another big difference between El Salvador and St. Kitts is the way that Bitcoin was handled with the government. We're kind of talking about the government again, but this is in a different context. While it is true that Bitcoin Cash is not a legal tender, if it becomes a legal tender, we don't know in what form. We don't know how it will be implemented. But one big difference is that in St. Kitts, at least now, Bitcoin Cash is optional. If you are a merchant and someone comes to you and wants to pay in Bitcoin Cash, you have the option of accepting it or not accepting it. Now in El Salvador, it's a bit different. Let's say that you sell pupusas. It's like a local, delicious, cheese-filled, I think, cornmeal cake. If someone comes to buy a pupusa from you, you must accept Bitcoin. According to the law, you are forced to accept it. The US dollar used to be an IOU for a set amount of gold. Now in Bitcoin, we have a similar situation. If someone comes and wants to pay in Bitcoin, and you as a merchant are forced by law, the threat of law, that you must accept it, well, does that mean you actually have to accept BTC on chain? Or does it mean that you need to accept an IOU for BTC, which is Lightning or PayPal? Those are not actually Bitcoin. They are different solutions that are built on top of it, but they're not Bitcoin. But in this case, let's say that you are a merchant and you are forced by law to accept Bitcoin, and someone sends you Bitcoin on chain, let's say to buy a pupusa. Bitcoin can be very slow. Do you force them to sit in your restaurant for the minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, or years it takes for that Bitcoin to go through before you give them the food? Well, what happens if you give them the food and they do a chargeback, which unfortunately is very possible with Bitcoin? These are elements that maybe will be figured out when they clarify the law. The law is very sloppily written, and it seems like it was written by someone who doesn't really understand Bitcoin. But the bigger issue here in El Salvador is just the fact you as a merchant are required to accept it against your will. If someone comes in and wants to buy something in Bitcoin and you don't like Bitcoin, you don't want anything to do with it, you don't have a choice. You must accept it. Up until now, as far far as I know, there has been no repercussions for not accepting Bitcoin. The law says you must do it. Sort of like having a road in your hometown that says 25 miles per hour. If you speed doing 40 up and down and the cops don't pull you over, it doesn't mean that you're not breaking the law. And at any minute, they can crack down on you breaking the law. But it is indeed against the law to not accept Bitcoin if you are in a position to accept it. A great example of that is Starbucks. In my recent trip to El Salvador, Starbucks was no longer accepting Bitcoin at any of their locations, and they had been at the time that Bitcoin went into law. Technically speaking, all of those locations are indeed breaking the law by not accepting it, but I guess they figure until there's repercussions, we're just not going to deal with this. Now, I know what you're thinking. In America, if someone comes into your business and wants to pay you $1, you must accept the dollar. You can't say no and take acorns or bottle caps. Actually, that's not accurate. If I open a business, I'm allowed to accept whatever I want. I can accept Bitcoin, I can accept acorns, I can accept bottle caps, I can accept yen, I can accept pesos, I can accept whatever I want. What legal tender for the US dollar does in the US, it means that if I owe money to someone, if I have a debt to someone, I am allowed to repay them with whatever is the legal tender. In this way, legal tender in the US is fair and just. If I owe someone money, if there is a debt, the legal tender law protects me being able to pay them in a standard currency. In El Salvador, you must accept Bitcoin if offered. Debt or not. In the US, you must accept US dollars if you have a debt with someone. Another difference between St. Kitts and El Salvador is just on the currency that they chose to use. So in the case of St. Kitts, they chose Bitcoin Cash as the currency that most people on the island use, which means that you don't need third-party complexities, middlemen, all kinds of solutions in order to do something very simple, right? Which is to send money from one person to another person, peer-to-peer electronic cash, right? You can send a penny to someone in St. Kitts for 1/20th of a penny, pretty much instantly. You don't have to worry about chargebacks. It just works, right? In El Salvador, they chose Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin has a lot of great properties. Like probably the most impressive aspect of Bitcoin is the fact that it tends to hold its value very well in the marketplace. That is not something that you should turn your face away, right? Bitcoin Cash has not held very well in the marketplace. So that aspect of it is great. Of course, there is the issue with Bitcoin where the value of it has so immensely dropped when we didn't expect it. But again, crypto is volatile. So it could be a year that the price of Bitcoin goes significantly higher than it was when El Salvador made it a legal tender. However, because of the complexity of Bitcoin, where it simply does not work as peer-to-peer electronic cash, there needs to be solutions built on top of it. Unfortunately, a lot of these solutions are less than ideal. One solution was for the government to spend huge and undisclosed amounts of tax money to hire nationals from other countries to build a government-sponsored quasi-public, quasi-private company named Chivo that developed an app, a wallet to handle all of this using another cryptocurrency named Algorand. The whole thing is a mess and the tool simply failed. And that's not hyperbole. The tool actually failed multiple times of me using it personally, but also everyone pretty much knows that Chivo just doesn't work. It's a bad app, it's a bad tool, and it wasted a lot of money. But that happened because it was necessary to make something that could make Bitcoin functional within the context of a country's economy. Other solutions are also less than ideal, right? So many of the wallets that are used in El Salvador are custodial, things that are really gross like Strike, which you do not hold your own money. It's just use a bank. Just use a bank and PayPal, right? You're not actually holding your own cash. Other solutions are also less than ideal, right? We have PayPal, Cash App, Strike. These are really dirty programs. You don't actually hold the money yourself, but you kind of need them to provide the liquidity to send money between people using Lightning or using just PayPal, whatever. Again, with St. Kitts, you don't need any of that. It just works. Also in El Salvador, you have people using the Lightning Network, which is great. Let's say if you are independently wealthy and you have enough money to fund your own channel and you are okay with the idea that your channels can be censored by other people who don't like your channel. Most people are not in a position technically or financially to have their own channels, so they have to rely on middlemen, which kind of dirties the idea of peer-to-peer electronic cash, at least in my opinion. But overall, we have a situation where we have St. Kitts, which chose Bitcoin Cash, which has been not a very well performing asset at least right now. That could very well change in the future. Versus in El Salvador, they chose a crypto that, unlike Bitcoin Cash, is performing very well in the market, at least in comparison to other cryptocurrencies, but it's come at the expense, basically choosing a cryptocurrency that is crippled and relies on other cryptocurrencies to function, such as Algorand, custodial solutions, and even in the case of non-custodial wallets, still relies on middlemen in the form of nodes that at any minute can censor or silence or become centralized. So both cryptos have pros and cons. This isn't really a discussion of, let's say, the philosophical disagreements of the two cryptos. I hold both. They both have a functional place within my portfolio. I'm also not going to blow smoke and say that Bitcoin Cash is amazing when it performs so terribly, and Bitcoin is amazing when it functionally performs terribly. So there you go. Differences between the two. Anyway, this video is probably gone on long enough. There's obviously a lot of differences between the two locations, but there are some similarities, right? So having people have their own money that cannot be distorted by, let's say, a Federal Reserve, where people do not have to deal with predatory financial systems and inflation, where in the case of Bitcoin, yeah, there are middlemen. Perhaps it's not as bad as dealing with Western Union. And with Bitcoin Cash, yeah, the price has not been performing so well, but at least you are in control of your own finances, where you don't rely on middlemen and channels and liquidity pools and any of this unnecessary dirty stuff. More importantly, the average person has access to a broader range of tools that I believe are indeed necessary despite their pros and their cons. I think overall this is something to be hopeful with. I think it's interesting and positive to see countries and at least large groups of people, large populations of people becoming interested in cryptocurrency and having access to it. I'm curious to hear though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on Bitcoin in El Salvador versus Bitcoin Cash in St. Kitts? Was there anything that I missed? Was there anything that I was blatantly wrong about? I'd love to hear your perspective. Like always, thanks for watching and stay sharp.